Welcome to CDC's program of Inside Events. My name is Colin Buckley, and I will be chairing today's event that looks at tackling the global climate crisis in a just and inclusive way. Before we start, I wanted to remind you that we will take audience questions in the later part of the event, and so please use the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen to post those questions, and we'll be sure to pick them up when we can later today. The climate crisis has been called the challenge of our generation, and its potential impacts almost defy calculation. In addition to being pernicious, however, climate change is also inequitable. Harm will fall disproportionately on the poor, on women, on the dispossessed. As if solving climate problems was not complex enough, we must also ensure that the solutions address those inequities. I'm joined today by Dr. Tara Shine to explore how we can deal with the climate crisis in a just manner. Dr. Shine is an environmental scientist and director at Change by Degrees, an environmental consultancy. She's also the chair of the International Institute for Environment and Development. Dr. Shine has a wealth of experience as an international climate change negotiator and advisor to world leaders on environmental and climate policy and on climate justice. She was recently appointed by the United Nations to oversee the next international review of the global climate goals. And her first book, How to Save Your Planet, One Object at a Time, was published earlier this year. So welcome, Tara.
Thank you so much, Colin.
So Tara, 2020 was meant to be a pivotal year in the battle against climate change, marking the beginning of a decade of action on climate change and the SDGs. And then out of nowhere, the pandemic struck. So can you bring us up to date? I mean, what impact has COVID had on the climate cause?
Yeah, it's been quite a year, hasn't it? I think if you were to measure the impact of COVID on the most basic indicator, greenhouse gas emissions, it has had very little impact. So although we had an initial fall in emissions during the initial stages of the pandemic, when we had sort of a worldwide lockdown, still we weren't getting more to a 7 to 9% a reduction in emissions. And this year, as with the previous years, our emissions continue to grow. So on that basic indicator, we're not doing well. I know that at the moment that the pandemic hit in March, April, my first concern was that, will anybody be able to think about climate? Or will all attention be taken up by the pandemic? I think what we've seen as the year has rolled out is that in some ways, the pandemic has focused minds on how you recover, what kind of societies we want to live in, what is it to be resilient as a company, as a community, as a society, and there climate has a space. And also, as people have focused on risk and understanding their exposure to risk, in this case, pandemic risk, they've been quickly reminded that the next risks coming are climate related, they're nature related, they're natural disaster related. And so if we're not ready for the pandemic and we're not able to cope with it, then it means we won't be able to cope with these other risks. So I do think it's been a bit of a topsy-turvy year in that way. And in some moments of this year, I felt great hope as well for our ability to act on climate, because I think we've torn up the rule book. So what was impossible in 2019? In 2019, we would probably have had to travel to London or something to do this as a live event, okay? And I would have done it. And I would have said, well, that's a good cause. It's a good reason to these people, you know, they want to change the world. They're aligned with me. Of course I'll do it. And it would have been normal. Whereas now, you know, I'm totally going to in the future say, no, let's do it online. So that kind of necessity to have to travel if something was important, if it was important enough, you would travel to it. I think that has been erased. I think likewise, many of us confined within our own communities have had time to stop and pause and consider the value we place on that community, on our neighbors, on our neighborhoods, on the nature that surrounds us. And so I think these are some of the good things. We've started to realize a little bit, we've had a bit of pause for thought for what is quality of life. And I hope we can remember that as we now design the society we want to live in, as we recover from this year in 2021, that we keep the good things that we got from this pandemic. And certainly from the climate side of things, we just need to do more. Whilst there has been good momentum this year from countries and from companies in setting long-term goals for 2050 around being carbon neutral, net zero, that's really good. I'm really pleased to see that long-term vision. But in the short term, our emissions keep going up and the climate impacts keep going up. So this year, the World Meteorological Organization just showed that this year we are already at 1.2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. We can't go above 1.5. Above 1.5, we create irreversible change. And that's not just bad for ecosystems, it's bad for us. It's bad for us as human beings. We've had a year of unprecedented climate impacts, unprecedented warming. We've had enough reminders. If you think back to the beginning of the year, think about the wildfires that have been raging in Australia. They then raged through the west coast of the United States towards September time. We've had plenty of reminders of climate impacts and that it's right here and we need to do something about it. So I hope that our ability or inability to deal with the pandemic is a strong lesson learned in terms of the impetus for preparing to live with climate.
Well, we'll come back to the future of the broader climate change sort of campaign. But if I could, can we speak a little bit about climate justice? Because you're a passionate campaigner on the topic of climate justice. Here at CDC, our natural markets are developing countries. So I'm wondering if you could help us kind of put those together. And what does climate justice mean for developing countries, where the ones that we partner with?
Yeah, so the best way to understand climate justice is to start off with what's unjust about it. So if you talk to your kids, even if they're 3 or 4 years old, those of you who have kids, they understand what is fair and unfair from a very young age. So this is something we all understand. And so I was just trying to explain some of this in a lecture for young people with the Royal Institution in London last week. And when you understand that the people that are most affected by the impacts of climate change right now are the people who contributed least to the problem, it is clear that that's unfair. So the people that don't drive around in an SUV, that don't own a fancy house, they may not even have electricity in their home, that have never been on an airplane, their emissions are zero. They suffer the worst impacts of climate change. That to me to anybody is fundamentally unfair. And so climate justice accepts that that's unfair and tries to find ways to put that right. Climate justice is very much a people-centered approach to dealing with climate change, climate action, and sustainable development. It is embedded in human rights. So obviously, climate impacts undermine people's human rights, their rights to food, to water, to shelter. But climate action can also, if not done correctly, also undermine human rights. If we make poor decisions about where we make investments in renewable energy, for example, we can undermine the rights of the communities that live in those areas. If we don't look to share the benefits of climate action, whether that is cleaner air, cheaper fuel, but safer ways to get around, if we don't share those benefits equitably, then we only create further inequality in the world. And what we've seen from COVID, and we know from many aspects of looking at what causes and sustains poverty around the world, is when those people who are vulnerable whatever the crisis is, whether it is COVID or it is climate. And so climate justice is really about putting people at the center and making sure that we stop and check that nobody is unfairly burdened by the impacts of climate change or the responses to climate change. So we can't just create responses to climate change that are good for us in the developed world. They have to be good for everybody. We have to enable every country and every community to make the transition to a zero carbon sustainable future together. We can't leave some countries behind with dirty industry and dirty air. We have to bring everybody. And that is in our collective self-interest, because we can't keep warming to below 1.5 degrees if every country in the world isn't part of the effort. So climate justice helps us to kind of mobilize that solidarity and to see that it is obviously, as we all know, a global commons problem, but it's a question, its answers lie in finding solutions that benefit all, and that don't unfairly burden any one part of society. And that applies equally in developed and developing countries. In developed countries, we probably talk about it in terms of just transition. So how do we make the transition from a fossil fuel-based economy to a clean economy without some of our workers being unfairly burdened, or any unfair impacts on one part of the community. But obviously it applies on this wider scale too, in that, you know, if we look at small island states or least developed countries, as I say, they're responsible for very few emissions, yet their development prospects are eroded day after day by the impacts of climate change.
Yeah, I see the relative burden inequities and also the political dynamics that kind of leads to, and a lot of your job has been trying to negotiate between countries taking on their fair burden. I mean, for CDC, we principally invest and partner with private sector businesses in, for the large part, the sort of the victimized countries, the ones that are a little bit behind the development curve. So what is it that we can do beyond just helping our companies think about climate risk to add on this sort of that filter of climate justice? How can we bring that to our businesses?
Well, first of all, I would say keep at it with the climate risk. Look at coincident risks. Look at the risks of investing. Look at the risks of not investing. Look at who benefits from your investment. Does it actually flow down and have an impact at the local level? Does it benefit women and men equitably? Who benefits and who's disadvantaged by the investments that you make? You know, there are any number. If you look at the guideline, the human rights and business guidelines, they give you a really good orientation on top of just checking with your ESG guidelines what you're doing. You know, check against the human rights as well, and make sure that what you're doing is protecting people all the way too. It's also to get away from a sense of let's just do no harm, to really seeing, are we doing good, and making sure that every single investment is good for the planet and is good for people, and that you're absolutely robust on that. Because we are not yet at the point where we are adhering enough to, you know, the third part of the objective of the Paris Agreement, which is to ensure that all financial flows are consistent with the temperature goals set out in the agreement. And so we shouldn't be investing any money from this point forward that isn't contributing to the SDGs directly, and that isn't contributing to a net zero world by 2050. And the human rights lens helps you to make sure that you don't, in your efforts to save the planet, have any negative impacts on people.
Yeah, I mean, you played a pivotal role in the Paris negotiations, and it was a moment of great world focus and thinking back on it, optimism around climate change. But I was struck, you mentioned earlier, the direction of travel, and I think that we need to be cutting fossil fuels production by about 6% a year until 2030 to stay on track. And as you identified, in fact, fossil fuels production continues to increase at about 2%. So we're kind of going backwards. I mean, where are we on the Paris Agreement? And are we going backwards? Is there still a route forwards? Can you give us some sense of that kind of broader movement?
Yeah, so the direction of travel set by Paris has been influential. That's why I think we see these commitments from countries, cities, states, and large organizations around setting net zero by 2050 goals. So the direction of travel part of Paris has been very effective. I think it remains to be seen now at COP26 if the ratchet up mechanism, so nationally determined contributions that are then increased every 5 years, it remains to be seen whether we see enough increase in those commitments next year to say whether that's being effective in actually helping us to achieve the temperature goal. Because right now we're on track to 3 degrees or more of warming. So that needs to improve. In the finer detail of Paris, yes, there's definitely more to be done. So as I say, the ultimate measure is, are our emissions going down? No, they're not yet. So there's more work to be done there. But as a multilateral instrument, I think it is working, and it had managed to keep working and to keep us as a global community focused around a shared goal, even in the last few years where the US was disengaged. So I think that shows the strength of the agreement. Now, there are areas for improvement, definitely. I think we need to do a lot more in the area of global solidarity in the response to. So sort of breaking a little bit out of what I'm going to do within my own country and that nationally determined contribution part of things, to looking at, well, where do I fit in the world, and where does my effort fit in the world? And am I also contributing as a country to climate action in other countries? Am I taking steps to make other people in other countries less vulnerable to climate change? Particularly if I'm a wealthy country and I've had the benefits of that kind of fossil fuel powered industrialization to drive the development of my country. And with the fossil fuels, I guess it's again, if you try and explain this to a young person, they get very quickly very frustrated with you, because they say, right, we know what causes climate change. Okay, fossil fuels are a key part of it. Land use is obviously something else as well. But fossil fuels are key. Do we know how to operate life without fossil fuels? In many sectors we do. Not in all, but in many sectors we do. So why don't we just stop using them? Why can't we keep them in the ground? Why can't we phase out their use so much more? And then you have to look at things like fossil fuel subsidies and say, this is some of the most cracker stuff that we're doing. So, you know, that there are still these tough political decisions that we do not have political decision makers taking. I would love to see our leaders looking at some of these issues. And this is, I mean, leaders of governments as well as leaders of financial institutions, leaders of big multinational companies saying, well, how are we together going to tackle some of these big issues? How can we collaborate? Yeah, we want a level playing field for all of us, but let's all together say, right, enough of these fossil fuel subsidies and take them away, as an example. So that leadership, where it is for the greater good, the collaborative in a form of solidarity, I don't see enough of our leaders there yet. I think that's the next place they've got to get to.
So before we bring in Holger and Maren, one more question. If you can take out your crystal ball, COP26 will be in the UK sort of next year. I mean, do you have any thoughts? What might be the headline or the paradigm shift that might come out of COP26?
So my dream headline would be that countries of the world come to the table with commitments that will keep us safe and will keep warming to 1.5. That would be my dream headline. In terms of things that I'd like to see emerge from the COP, I think I would really like this COP to, as I spoke about, give leadership. So I would like it to have this bigger picture around how the countries are going to collaborate to solve these problems. I would like the decisions that are taken to be very much informed by science. So the role I'm playing at the moment with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is around a science policy dialogue and making sure that policymakers have time to stop and pause while not negotiating, to be informed by and learn about the latest science and how that science has filled gaps in knowledge that we had in 2015. So for example, in 2015, we understood very little about the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees. We understand so much more about that now. So that has to inform the decisions that policymakers take. So I hope that the science informs the decision-making and that we have space for that. And then I hope that this COP can be really, truly inclusive. And I mean that the voices of the most vulnerable countries are heard at the negotiating table, but also that the COP reaches a wider community, that it reaches the communities around it in Glasgow, and that they feel part of it, that they know what it is and know why it's important that their city is hosting it. But likewise, that spreads across the rest of the UK, and that we can use these new ways of interacting and communicating online to ensure that what a COP is more widely understood and more widely accessible to more people. That that forces us to be more transparent and more accountable in how the negotiations are run. It forces us to stop speaking in mumbo jumbo jargon that nobody else can understand. It forces us to be clear in why decisions are being taken and how. So improving the participation in the COP, helping it to land down from that kind of being a spaceship floating above the earth as it sometimes is, into something that is embedded in the reality of everyday lives, so that people understand its role and why it's important to them. That would be another thing I would really like to come from COP26.
Well, that gives us some realistic goals to aim for. So thank you. Let me widen this out now and introduce two CDC panelists. The first is Holger Rothenbusch, who is Managing Director and Head of the Infrastructure and Climate Change team here at CDC Group. And also Maren Wiersma, who is a gender finance consultant and the interim gender lead, also here at CDC. And before I bring the two of you in, let me remind our audience once again, we're looking for good questions. Just use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, post the questions, and we will do our best to answer all of them. So let me start out. Holger, I mean, Tara has outlined a number of actions that the private sector can take to help meet the climate challenge. And I was wondering, based on your experience in the industry and in commercial banks, how do we get private businesses and financial institutions to commit to meaningful action on climate change?
Yeah, thanks, Colin, and good afternoon to all on the call. Well, I think it's I think not a mystery that in particular commercial banks, but private investors in many instances are not necessarily sort of at the forefront of developments or very innovative. They are mainly, focused on maximizing profits, which is what companies do. So I think obviously this is a discussion that has been around for a long time. And when you look at what initially sort of started out were international standards having been established, like the Equator Principles, which have been around for quite a number of years. And that certainly over time, increasingly led to improved environmental and social standards being applied by the banking industry and by the private sector investors in general. And clearly, those standards are being tightened. And at the moment, many on the call will know about the TCFD initiative that was started by the ex-governor of the Bank of England, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which again, I think is the next standard that is being introduced by many institutions, which will focus on risk management related to climate. And that again, I think is the next step in pushing providers of capital into the right direction. Clearly, there are sort of other avenues which we are increasingly seeing, and that has also been there for a while, which are sort of investor activism, where shareholders of banks are exerting pressure, where we are increasingly seeing interest of investors to invest in green funds, for example, that ultimately created an incentive for managers of funds, for example, or then also green banks to start invest more into climate-friendly investments. So I think those are all very positive effects that one would have observed over the last years. What I certainly see right now is, I think ultimately, in my view, what will really make a bigger difference to this, which is that very much driven by change of technology, which is focusing on the renewables like solar and wind. Those technologies for the longest time were very difficult to implement in an economic fashion. Nowadays, solar power is cheaper than most thermal power plants, and that is a very strong economic argument. And just on the back of this, the market rationale is really shifting towards investments in renewable energy. And when you look at the statistics in 2019, the vast majority of new additional power that was created around the world was renewable energy. So it was actually close to 80% thereof. So this is really happening, and that is not because of any standards or principles, rather than it just makes good business sense, which is a very fortunate confluence of factors coming together, because that is ultimately what will move the markets and commercial investors. I mean, clearly institutions like CDC with our objective, we have been focused on this for some time, and we are certainly at the forefront of this evolution, trying to support new technologies and trying to make projects commercially viable in order to bring commercial capital in. But overall, it's as I had said, I do see that the market forces are driving in the right direction. Probably not at the speed that we need this to, and we can come back to this later. But it's certainly the direction is the right one.
Thanks, Holger. And Tara, we spoke about what private businesses could do in the context of climate justice, but what can banks and investors do around inclusion and climate justice? And to make it a little bit more direct, what is it that they should do more of, and what is it potentially that they should stop doing in order to promote climate justice?
Thank you, Colin. Yeah. So I think a key thing is that even with investors that are very well briefed on ESG, I still think we're separating environment and social far too much. I still don't think we actually understand how the two things are linked, and how they go hand in hand. And we need to break them out of their silos and show that they're one in the same thing, when really what we're striving to do is to make a better society with good returns, obviously, on investments and improve people's lives. So there's still not enough finance and investment getting to the local level in the developing economies that you're, for example, in CDC investing in. It's not getting down to the bottom. How are you measuring that? Where does the flow of your investment end? Is it just benefiting sort of at the level of the capital city? Is it actually getting out into the regions? Is it really getting down and changing people's lives? How much of that is actually ending up benefiting women? Do you know? If you don't know, can you find out? Because I think this is the key thing. You know, money gets to a certain point and then it gets stuck. How much of it is actually getting out through either decentralized systems or effective healthcare systems, education systems, out to where really it's needed? So I think that's something we need to ask ourselves a lot more about. IIED did some research in 2016 and found that only 10% of international climate finance was making it to the local level. So where is it stuck, and why is it stuck? Research that was done by the OECD just after the Paris climate COP found also that not enough spending on climate action from bilateral aid, for example, that was what they looked at, that not enough of that climate finance was actually having a gender dimension to it. And that very, very little of that climate finance was actually going to support women's civil society or community-led organizations. So there is a constant struggle to get funding into the hands of the change makers at the local level. Many of those change makers are women. They may not have the right connections to be connected with the right people to get at this money. You may have to create more innovative ways of dispersing that money. You may have to throw the whole thing up in the air and look at it differently. But if you don't stop and ask, where is the money going? Who is benefiting? Who isn't benefiting? You're never going to know. And I would challenge that to all investors, to actually know right to the end of the line who's benefiting from the investment. And you also asked me, sorry, Colin, what not to do. Well, don't just keep throwing money into holes if you don't know where it's going, and if you don't know what it's changing. And if you can't show how it is A, creating a return, B, improving people's lives, and that you're certain that you're not making their lives worse, and C, not just avoiding harm in the environment, but actually doing something beneficial to the environment, then stop doing it.
Okay, very direct. Thanks, Tara. And Holger, the same question to you. I mean, Tara suggests the answer is making sure that investment gets to a local level. Your thoughts?
Yeah, look, I mean, one can only agree with this. And clearly, CDC, I mean, we are focused on this, and well, we do have the time and the resource to really make sure to understand where our capital is going with regards to targeting at women-led businesses, for example, or when we are investing in the off-grid solar industry, for example, where the vast majority of ultimate beneficiaries are women and well, children as well. And I think it may not be as difficult for pure commercial investors to actually get more cited on this as well. I think it does take an effort to ask the right questions. And then I think it's definitely doable to invest in such causes because, as I said earlier, commercially, these are sort of, in most cases, very attractive. So you can marry the financial return aspirations with ultimately, achieving an impact that goes beyond this. But it does take that effort in order to, A, get the information, but also, I suppose, to appreciate what value is ultimately being created by reaching the local communities, but also by being inclusive. Long-term and really successful investors, in particular in our markets in Africa and in South Asia, they will consider the social license to operate in pursuing their business. Obviously, if you have a short-term hit and run investment approach, I mean, that doesn't really create value possibly for oneself in the very short term, but it doesn't really create anything in the long run. But if you are really sort of a long-term investor, it is critically important to be looking at the social license to operate. And there have been numerous examples more recently where projects on the infrastructure side or companies have lost that and have been faced with very dire consequences. So I think it is really from a good business context as well to really ask the questions and to see how far you can really push this. Related to the just transition, I would just want to add one point. I mean, clearly there are lots of companies, both within, let's say, infrastructure sectors like power, but also then on the manufacturing side, which do rely on fossil fuel. And I mean, one of the challenges indeed is how do we ensure that individuals, in particular staff or supply chains that are linked to those companies, they don't get unnecessarily burdened by positive climate action. One example is an HFO, a sort of a heavy fuel oil power plant that CDC owns a minority stake in Kenya. It's a historic investment, and that is going to be decommissioned next year. And so what we're doing right now is to look at the decommissioning plan, which explicitly is including the questions on what is going to happen with staff, what is going to happen with the suppliers to this power plant, in order to ensure that there's a comprehensive solution to this. But we're doing this now because at the time, obviously, when the investment was made, all these questions weren't on the table, but now they are. And as part of the NDCs, as part of the Paris-aligned pathway, investors have to engage on those questions to think their investments through to the end, including those implications that might arise on parts of the population that would be infected in a detrimental way, such that they don't be left stranded, whilst the investment might be perfectly sensible from a financial perspective, but it may ultimately burden on the local community. So it's a lot more involved, the process that one has to go to, but it's really necessary for us to do this.
Maren, Tara had identified that part of the big problem is that we keep thinking of climate change issues and social issues, and we're not combining the two. And it's true, most of us often think of gender in one silo and climate in another silo. You're well known for bringing them together. So can you help us? Why are gender and climate change issues so intertwined?
Thank you, Colin. I think indeed Tara started speaking about this. So the link between gender and climate is, on the one hand, women are more vulnerable. And exactly as Tara well explained, if you explain this to kids, that it is unfair. So if you're disproportionately affected by climate change and you have very little lever to contribute to solutions. So on the one hand, climate vulnerability, on the one hand, climate leadership. Women are not only suffering the consequences, they can also be a real part of the solution. And then if we take it one level, let's say down, then so on the one hand, to combine climate and gender is the right thing to do. You cannot disregard half of the population. And on the other hand, it's the smart thing to do. And so a gender responsive climate actions are a market opportunity. I think Holger also started to speak about that. And maybe I can just enlighten that with two examples. One, on the vulnerability side, if you look at the water and sanitation field, women are key customers of water and sanitation services, yet they only make up a small percentage of the workforce. while evidence shows that their inclusion makes projects much more effective, up to 6 to 7 times more effective. And then on the leadership side, if we look at the energy and power sector, companies with more women on board, let me get the numbers right, invest more in renewable energy and in energy efficiency, and currently only 16% of the energy utility boards are gender balanced. So I think a lot of work to do. So I hope this answers your question a bit, Colin. And so on the one hand, women are more vulnerable. On the other hand, they're a real part of the solution, and we need to bring their voices on board much more. And I think Tara is an excellent example and a case in point. The way you speak, Tara, the way you explain things is so helpful, makes it so easy to listen to you and to understand what needs to be done. So thank you for leading by example.
And Tara, really the same question. I mean, is in fact climate change an opportunity to advance gender equality, especially in developing countries?
Yeah, and it's almost the other way around. I don't think we can tackle climate change if we don't have all our best minds at the table, and if we don't have a diversity of views and perspectives. So there's no way we can solve, I don't even know if that's the right word, climate change, but stabilize our climate system if we don't have diversity at the decision-making table. What women bring is they bring skills around collaboration. Women are legacy-minded. Women have different perspectives to men. So they will look at a question from a different angle. That means they will suggest a solution that comes from a different angle. So it just would be daft to try and solve a problem as big as the climate crisis and leave some of your most clever or practically minded people, whatever it might be, outside the door. And the trouble is that, you know, in every single level, whether it's at the level of the COP26, where women are underrepresented on the leadership team, whether it's in government departments, whether it's in parliaments around the world, whether it's on the boards of major companies, women are underrepresented. And the higher up the level of seniority you go, the fewer women there are at the table. So we're doing something wrong, clearly. And maybe that's one of the reasons we're in the bind we're in, you know. Maybe as my former boss Mary Robinson says, climate change is a man-made problem with perhaps a feminist answer. Yeah, so this is something to think about quite philosophically. Would we, had we over the years had more women at the decision-making table, would we perhaps 20 years ago have acted, or even 10 years ago have acted more on climate change? But certainly, you know, if you look at any of the world's wicked problems and you want to solve them, then the more diversity, and I mean that more broadly than just women and men, but the more diversity in terms of race, ethnicity, economic background, all of these things, it just makes you have better answers to the question. Otherwise, even if you've got the most perfect checklist in the world, you will miss something because you will just lack a perspective. And you will miss something obvious, like you'll create a wonderful new public transport system and you'll wonder why the uptake of it is low. And it'll be because you forgot to put lights around the bus shelters and women feel unsafe going. Something absolutely obvious. And we've done that year after year. We've created cook stoves and we wonder why women don't use them. We never ask the women how they want to cook or what they cook or what way would they like their cook stove to work. And then we invest loads and loads of money and wonder why it didn't work. And so stopping to ask, stopping to include people, making time for participation. It sounds all very fluffy, especially if you're an engineer or you work in energy. It is absolutely what makes something successful or unsuccessful. So stopping to take that time is amazing. And I honestly think, you know, if you want an example, compare the leadership style of Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand with the leadership style of Donald Trump. Take two polar opposites and compare them. One is naturally collaborative. It's based on kindness. I love it that kindness is one of the underlying principles on which our government runs. You know, who ever heard of a government that didn't just measure itself in terms of GDP, but measures itself in terms of human kindness? And I think this is a real moment for us to say, well, look, we're open to all of this. How can we create new types of leaders on sustainability, men and women, that are more focused around kindness to the planet, kindness to their fellow human beings, and that are willing to collaborate. We have to get away from this mindset that the only way to achieve is for you to be the hero, rather than for there to be success and benefits for all. And we're not there yet on that one.
Thanks. Maren, can we speak a little bit about, how can we help empower women and girls through the global financial system? I mean, we've spoken a lot about the importance of the private sector and investment. So in a sense, we go back to the global financial system. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think there's two things we need to think about. On the one hand, is the leadership that Tara just very well spoke to. And so gender balance our decision-making platforms, boards of banks, boards of the companies they serve. And on the other hand, get more money into the hands of women so they can make their own decisions. And often, money that ends up in the hands of women is better spent, and goes towards household, etc., etc. But also, if you finance female-owned businesses, they also tend to solve real-world problems. So why I love female entrepreneurs, I love entrepreneurs, but I especially love female entrepreneurs. All of them bite off more than they can chew, but women tend to really want to solve real-world problems and then make money as a consequence of solving a real problem. So I think we have a great role to play as a financial institution. So on the one hand, getting more women in leadership very urgently, and on the other hand, getting much more money into the hands of women, which interestingly enough is not the case at the moment.
Thanks. And Holger, I mean, it's important that we widen out the discussions of gender beyond just having women talking about gender. And I know that you're a very kind of strong proponent of gender. I want to give you an opportunity to also speak about this topic.
Yeah, look, I mean, I don't really have in substance more to add what was already said by Tara and Marijn. I think it's to support women-led businesses, to ensure that managements and boards of companies are reflective of an appropriate level of diversification and so forth. And I think it's really what was mentioned by Tara and Marijn. I think the statistics and the studies are all very clear. Performances of businesses, of companies, of boards, they're just better. With the more diverse board, and some industries are definitely testimony to the point that Marijn said. The microfinance industry sort of very much revolves around women borrowers, and they are handling finances much more carefully rather than the other sex, which I'm afraid to admit, but I think that's just a fact. So it's hard to negate the facts. It is somewhat striking that we haven't quite sort of made more change than we have. But I would just like to reinforce that theme that I think Tara started with. The climate crisis is really sort of such magnitude, and that we have started to engage on, and COP26 is happening, but we are missing the sort of sense of urgency, and I think we are really needing to change tack in a very big way. And whenever you would look at a situation where you would really want to see significant change, well, to put a different set of people to work, I mean, that might be just part of the solution. You need other people, different views, different mindsets, different approaches to the old problems. If you keep running with the same team, which unfortunately in many instances is very much male dominated, well, you shouldn't be surprised if you keep coming up with the same solutions, or that you keep this whole process at a very sort of slow pace. So if you're really wanting to get serious about that, we really have to change tack, and we definitely have to get another team to drive this. So I'm very supportive of this, and that would be one of my great hopes for COP26, that we really get much faster on this, and that we get a different team largely than, or very much represented by women as well at the helm.
Thanks a lot. Okay, let's take some questions from the audience. Tara, if I can give you the first one. One audience member asks, is there a risk in waiting for a technology solution to climate change? And is that essentially what governments are doing at the moment?
Yes, there's a risk in waiting for a technology solution. So we're not short on, we actually know what to do. If we just did with the proven technologies, the action that we've said we would do right now, we would make massive progress. So we know how to do wind energy. We know how to do solar energy. We know how to do industrial processes in a less carbon intensive way. Sure, there are some things we haven't figured out. So we haven't found a cost effective way to extract carbon, to do direct carbon extraction from the atmosphere. All right. So, but we shouldn't be hanging around waiting for that, especially when we know that nature-based solutions work and that they are safe and they're proven. So there's nothing to stop us from massively increasing our investment in nature as our best ally, in terms of reducing the emissions from the land sector and also helping us to store and sequester carbon. So yeah, no, there's no excuses. Innovation will be at the heart of our sustainable future. We will learn to use technology in lots of different ways that will help us to be more sustainable. You know, even in doing the research for my book, I found that one of the key things that people need in the developed world to be more sustainable is access to the internet. So they can access these different sharing platforms that allow them to move away from owning something to accessing it as a service or to sharing it. So technology is definitely on our side, but technology is not a reason not to get going right now. We know what to do. We just need to do more of it right now. And that's where the investment community is key, because where you spend your money dictates what happens. You are the best barometer for whether we're serious or not about climate change, because every one of those millions of dollars that you invested in the right way helps us to reduce emissions.
Thank you. And next question to Maren. The question is whether climate justice also speaks to how we should handle those who are losers in the shift to more green economies, either those who lose jobs, like oil and gas employees, or those who lose livelihoods. What is there a side of climate justice that informs what we should do about them?
Yeah, so I think that speaks to the just transition. I think Holger also gave an example when he spoke about how CDC is dismantling a project and really trying to look at how not to leave anybody behind. And so I think that is where a whole debate going on and a whole, there's a lot of attention for that, and it needs to be built into the financial sector also and into all the long-term infrastructure projects that we are now signing. We didn't know when we had started the project Holger was talking about, but we do know now, so we have to build these factors in.
And Tara, would you like to add anything to that answer?
Yeah, no, it's absolutely part of it. So one of the principles of climate justice is that you share the burdens and the benefits of the transition equitably. And so, yeah, nobody, just because they happen to work in the fossil fuel industry or increasingly perhaps in something like the plastics industry, should be negatively impacted because of the need to shift the economy and the focus elsewhere. In Ireland, we have this, I live in Ireland, we have this on a small scale, looking at how we're going to support workers who've been working in our peat sector to find new jobs. And many of these workers are men in their 50s, perhaps their late 50s. So looking for retraining opportunities, new job opportunities that are there within their locality, which is quite a rural community, and that suit their training and their skills. Takes a bit of figuring out and is really important. We can't and we shouldn't leave anybody behind in this, but it requires planning. A key element of the just transition is you have to acknowledge that something is going to change and you have to plan for that change. And again, have human rights at the heart of what you're doing. So making sure that that person is going to have the same quality of life, or perhaps even you can create a better quality of life for them and their kids. Their kids may have better prospects in terms of education and job opportunities because of the actions that you take at this point in time.
Thank you.
Colin, if I can, I would just like to add that I mean, this has been happening for a very long time. We have seen, the coal or the steel industry, leaving many European countries, and whole industries were shut down. Loads of people were laid off, and then there were programs, there were new industries that were being put in, and so it's not that this is unprecedented. Rather than that's, I think, the new challenge that we are facing, but it absolutely can be done, and it had been done in the past. So I don't think it can be an excuse for inaction.
And thanks, Holger. And if I can stay with you, I've got a question which I know you've heard many times before. And the question is this: isn't the problem simply risk, and that DFIs aren't willing to take enough risk? And unless they take more risk, we won't have a just transition and combat climate change.
Yeah, gosh, I mean, the question about risk, I mean, that is indeed sort of a perennial one. But I would say that the majority of what DFIs like CDC and others are doing on the climate finance side is really sort of investing in renewable energy. I wish that we would be doing more in energy efficiency, resource efficiency, water. I mean, those are more difficult sectors to get into, but that's certainly a focus for us. I don't think ultimately that this is a risk. I think some of the models, let's say, that haven't been tested or proven, in particular on the technology side, I mean, to come to one of the question that was raised earlier, like storage. That at the moment, it's still quite hard to make work financially, and that's is maybe more difficult to fund at this point in time, but that's then sort of at the frontier of business models and projects where there may be some challenge, although there are loads of sort of promotional funds that would be looking at those. So on balance, I wouldn't really say that risk considerations stands in the way of DFIs making contribution to climate change. I think it is really. I think the order of magnitude is a challenge. And quite frankly, climate change isn't really coming out of the developing countries. I mean, as Tara said, this is the point of fairness. Many people in developing countries, and clearly there are some exemptions like India, which is a big emitter. But then the majority of countries in Africa, they don't really make any contribution to the global, to the climate change problem. So I think it's really more around adaptation. It is around resilience, but then it's also, for us to help them to create a growth path which will be sustainable on renewable energy basis, rather than getting locked in to a fossil fuel technology where some of these countries are heading towards. So I don't think that ultimately risk is one of our key challenges in that space.
Thanks, Holger. Tara, if I could ask maybe one last question before we wind up today. I mean, climate challenge is a huge, and it's almost impossible to imagine sometimes the scale of the problem. And we've spoken a lot about global collective action in Paris and COP26. But I know that you believe that individually we can all make a difference as well. And this is kind of part of the theme of your recent book, How to Save Your Planet One Object at a Time. So I was wondering if we could close out by you sharing 3 tips for our audience on how each one of us can personally make a difference in this effort.
Yeah, no, I'd love to. So, but just one thing first, just to close off from what we were discussing with Holger there, which is that, the key way to manage risk is to be more resilient, and a key strategy around being more resilient is to embed sustainability, all 17 SDGs, into your business model. So it just works. It's what we help in my business, Change by Degrees. It's what we help big and small businesses to do every day, to understand their risk, to prepare for it and be more resilient to it by having this longer term vision, and by looking beyond the narrow focus perhaps on environment or profit or the social side of things, to how are these things interconnected. So I highly recommend that as a strategy for reducing risk. Then, yeah, so, there's this endless story around what's the point in my individual actions in the face of a global problem, or you can take it to a country. What's the point in my small country acting on climate change if China's and the US are not doing their part? the point in all of this is that climate change is a global problem. Every single action that we take counts. And your power is not actually just in that action that you take, but actually in the influence that you have. So my three points that I generally make around this are, for an individual, I'm not going to tell you like specific things like improve your energy efficiency or retrofit your house. They're more fundamental things, which is get informed, right? Be curious, ask questions about things, stop before you buy something, question, you know, the big decisions you make in life. As an individual, your big decisions are around investments, your mortgage, your pension. Ask questions about them. Yeah. If something seems too cheap when you go to buy it, well, why is it? Like, ask about your food and where does it come from? If you can't find that out, don't buy it. Yeah. So get informed, then take an action. The best thing you can do in face of a huge, overwhelming problem is to get yourself unfrozen and do something about it. So take an action, whatever it is. Maybe it is just asking your financial advisor about your pension. Maybe it is making some change in your household to improve your energy efficiency. But take an action. And the third point then is share that. Tell others how you got on when you made that change. What was good? What money did you save? How did you feel better? How did you get fitter? How did you spend more time with your kids as a result? How did you have a better quality of life as a result? Because none of us will take these actions just to save the planet. We do them for ourselves first. And so sharing what works for you is one of the biggest powers that any of us has. And that applies whether you're just literally participating in your parents' association in your school, whether you're the CEO of a major company, or whether you're a community leader in something you do in your volunteer time. In all of those places, you have influence. So yeah, get informed, take an action, and tell people, share what you've done. Those are my things.
All right. Thank you very much, Tara. And thank you also to Maren and Holger. I mean, in summary, I was struck by the point made by both Maren and Tara that climate justice arguments are really simple enough to be understood by children. So why then is it so hard for adults to move on them? And certainly part of the problem may be that we don't have enough women and other diverse populations involved in the policy making. But if there's another refrain that Tara sounds, and you just did it again, it's that, I mean, we know the path that we have to take to climate change. We shouldn't be put off by the scale of the challenge. And instead, what we should do is just make sure that we are moving ahead, perhaps only one step at a time, but keep moving in the right direction, always with an eye towards the local and social impact that those steps will have. And if we do that, then perhaps we'll be fortunate enough to read the headlines at COP26 that you optimistically imagined for us. So thank you again. It's an unfortunate consequence of COVID and these Zoom calls that you can only enjoy the virtual applause at the end of your efforts. But thank you, each one of you. And to the audience, thank you for your questions. We couldn't get to all of them, but we will share all of the questions with those panel members. And we invite you back for the next Insight event. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to the panel. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.